Thank you for the welcome and thanks everyone for being here. So basically, in preparing this talk, I found myself kind of working between a couple of recent monographs published at the tail end of last year that both talk about this film that I mentioned in my title, Grass, A Nation's Battle for Life from 1925, but they do so only for a paragraph or two as something that's sort of adjacent to their primary topic. The first is, unfortunately, my own study of scientific Western films projecting America. The other one is one some of you will know, Monodam Luji's Pipeline Cinema, a study of documentary films and the oil industry in Iran and Iraq. Now, I think silent Western films and a sort of proto-documentary about Iran, like Grass, a film that I'll introduce properly soon, might not seem like the most logical pairing. But in fact, when it was released in 1925, this film's connections to the Western genre were something that was widely noted by both critics and others involved in the film industry. And though Grass remains well known as something of maybe a landmark title in the history of documentary filmmaking, these important early links or alliances with the Western genre seem to have dropped out of discussions of it pretty much entirely. And so today I want to try to cast a light on those and for quite a specific reason. To put it quite simply, what I aim to do here is to explore how the Western film genre conventions, and in particular its narratives and rhetoric about the idea of the frontier, stories about the edge of colonial expansion, in other words, were deployed to do two things that we can explore via Grass. The first was to contribute to a popular idea from the silent era about how the motion picture might serve as a tool for producing and circulating knowledge and understanding between disparate peoples, cultures, and geographies. And the second related idea is that its use of a kind of narrative familiar from Western movies helped to rationalize the neo-colonial impulses of companies like the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, forerunner to BP, to reshape and ultimately exploit said people, cultures, and geographies. Essentially, I think there's an under-discussed but decisive link in this moment between the development of the Western film, which I'm understanding here as a kind of archetypal US colonial narrative about claiming and exploiting a continent, and the oil film, and in turn, the development of documentary cinema. So I want to start though with a clip from a short British-made oil film from 1938, Dawn of Iran.
16 years ago, the great empire had disappeared. Iran, once ruler of the world, was reduced to a country 12 times the size of England. A high tableland covered with snow and ice in winter, scorched in summer. The roads of Iran had disappeared. The great cities had decayed. A feudal system oppressed the countryside. Deprived of central government, large numbers of people had become nomad tribesmen, yearly migrating from grassland to grassland. But bubbling out of the foothills in the southwest were signs of the existence underground of the one thing for which the Western world was searching: natural crude oil. For centuries, tribesmen had made bitumen and a primitive kind of burning oil from the surface seepages. In 1908, far below the surface, oil was discovered in commercial quantities. Out of the chaos of the World War came a new leader, Reza Khan, colonel of an Iranian Cossack regiment. In 1921, Reza Khan, with a handful of men, marched into Tehran and assumed direction of affairs. He started to rebuild this barren, disorganized country. Men who had never seen a motor car, never used anything more mechanical than a wooden plow, started to work in steel and cement to handle tools and machinery.
Okay, so My reason for starting with this is that what we have here in Dawn in Iran, or Dawn of Iran, I should say, is quite a typical narrative found in a number of oil films that were produced by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company between the 1920s and the 1950s, ones discussed at length and probably more knowledgeably by Damluji in her book. Corporate films that were made, as we see on screen, in the name of public relations for the film industry, less to advertise their product as a commodity and more to link their companies to things like cultural and scientific progress and modernization more broadly. Now, for a bit of context, as we heard something off in this clip, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had been founded in 1909 to exploit the country's oil resources and controlled from 1914 onwards by the British government. American interest would follow in years to come, but for now, Britain broadly had a kind of stranglehold here. And as we see here, though, Britain never established formal colonial rule in Persia. It relied on the oil extracted there for its military power and industrial modernization. Basically, life in Britain and elsewhere relied on this oil while the people producing it suffered. To maintain and operate the infrastructure, the roads, the housing, the railroad, the pipelines that were needed to exert this kind of neo-colonial control over the nation's oil resources, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company employed, exploited, and dehumanized a massive international workforce. And among the results of these exploitative conditions, compounded by the fact that only a small percentage of the oil income stayed in the country, were 5 major strikes by oil workers between the 1920s and the start of the 1950s, when Iran's oil industry would be nationalised with control seized from what was now called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to secure sovereignty over its natural resources. In oil films like Dawn in Iran, then, there's a clear recognition, I think, of the power that cinema might have to influence public opinions. And in this case, it puts forward these positive images of a thriving industry and infrastructure, and does so for quite a specific purpose: to divert attention, mainly outside of Iran, away from the abuses of and unrest within oil industry workforces. And as we just saw, to sort of shower praise on the regime of Reza Shah Pahlavi, whose favour could help in suppressing this kind of labour organising. Now, the films that I want to focus in on today were released in the prior decade, but they were also ones made firmly with a recognition of cinema's power to influence public opinion in mind. In fact, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the ones I'll be talking about were routinely cited as perhaps the foremost example of a very common idea in the first few decades of film, in the silent era especially, that the moving visual medium of cinema represented somehow a new kind of universal language, understood alike by all, regardless of where they were from, and therefore a singular force for spreading understanding between peoples and cultures. The ones that I'll be looking at today were released not by the oil industry, but by major American studios at a time where, like the oil business, they would try to present themselves as an industry ideally placed to use modern technology in the name of some kind of progress, pushing the idea that it could usher in, let's say, a resplendent future of global harmony was a key public relations strategy at this point, by which Hollywood in its first decades sought to do things like mute criticism of its product's growing influence within the US, and also challenge criticism of its dominance of markets more globally. The main film I'll focus in on to do this was one that in this period was widely declared a prime example of exactly this kind of cinema of global understanding, 1925's Grass, A Nation's Battle for Life, one that follows the Bakhtiari people of Persia on an epic seasonal migration to pasture for their livestock. It's also known for being the first collaboration between the creators of King Kong, Merian C. and Ernest B. Schoedsack. And I'll be thinking about this film, I should say, in relation to some westerns that I discuss in my book, a cycle of epic historical westerns, to be specific, inaugurated by Paramount's The Covered Wagon in 1923, a story of the pioneers in their wagon trains making their way across the continent to settle in the West in the 1840s. These pioneers were figures widely celebrated at this point as probably the most significant forebears for the modern US nation. Now, the prodigious success of this film here, The Covered Wagon, would inspire further films, for which I've put posters on screen, recounting what were also presented as decisive episodes from the development of the US nation, such as the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 as featured in 1924's The Iron Horse, and the supposedly inevitable demise of Native Americans, as depicted in 1925's The Vanishing American. Now, as I said at the outset, given that the Western is all about the perceived patriotic heroes of the 19th century United States, grass might seem like something quite far removed from it. But as I said, they in fact invited regular comparison amongst observers of the day, and in early discourses around the documentary, acclaimed as perhaps the finest exemplars yet made for exactly this kind of unifying, edifying, laudable way of exploiting the motion picture's vast popular appeal that I mentioned a moment ago. So I want to unpack this idea a little further before going anywhere else. The worker with a poor vocabulary is equal to the scientist. Universal education is the message. Time and distance have been annihilated by the magic film to bring together the peoples of the world. These were novelist Jack London's thoughts on cinema in 1915, and they were very commonplace ones at this time too. Of course, cinema was hardly the first technological development to potentially be embraced in this way as a means of overcoming human distance and difference. Before it, you'd had photography, which had also been regarded as a kind of democratic, universal picture language, one that would allow people, anyone, to view and apprehend other places and cultures instantly without recourse to words. And all of these technologies had been presented as kind of offering new ways of seeing the world, ones that did, of course, hinge on the petroleum involved in early photography and taking cameras and their operators to distant places, and latterly in the making of, I suppose, celluloid film strips. But the motion picture would add something new to what came before the still photography, not just in terms of movement, but in terms of large-scale industrial production, international networks of distribution, and in turn the kinds of vast globe-spanning audiences that it could reach, ones that might have been geographically disparate, but were brought together in this shared act of viewing the same images within motion picture theatres. And Hollywood had very quickly come to exemplify this kind of globe-spanning culture of film production and distribution and viewing when it took off in the US as the movie capital from the 1910s onwards. Like its oil counterpart, the movie business would soon be kind of a key agent fueling how people experience modernity, helped by the fact that the films produced in Hollywood had such a sort of massive global reach. And that said, though, the singular broadness of the Hollywood motion picture's seeming influence was certainly not something that was universally welcomed, with calls for censorship and accounts of film colony iniquity making regular headlines as early as the early 1920s even. And so accused of things like dragging down public morals with debased subject matter in films and scandal-beset stars, and faced with a pressure to reform, studio heads turned to this idea that I touched on, of cinema as a tool for mass education and mass understanding. In 1922, they would appoint William H. Hayes, who would later give his name to the famous Hays Code, as the first president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, to kind of clean house and legitimize the power of the movies that had elsewhere been deemed pernicious. Throughout the 1920s, Hayes would lead Hollywood studios in promoting an idea really central to how it justified its cultural power. Again, this idea that the sway mass entertainment seemed to hold over the public didn't need to be the bad thing that many had feared, but as we see on the screen here, was something that could do more than any existing agency to unite the peoples of the world by bringing about better understandings, not only between man and man, but between nation and nation. Similarly, here we have the general manager of the leading Paramount studio for much of the decade, Walter Wanger, making a similar case, comparing his studio's undertakings to foreign offices that could work to overcome discord and miscommunication and promote peace between global peoples. In fact, inspired by the success of Robert Flaherty's famous film on the lives of the Inuit people of Canada's northern Quebec region, Nunavut of the North, from 1922, Wanger's studio, Paramount, would, under his influence, develop a reputation in the silent era for what were sometimes called outdoor pictures or natural dramas, basically films that look to familiarize audiences with the range and diversity of human experience and culture. And these are films that tend to be discussed today as key films in the history of the documentary, but both in the 20s and in subsequent writings of interested observers, including key members of the documentary film movement like John Grierson, I want to note also that they were often seen to belong to a tradition that included the epic historical westerns that had become so popular in this same decade. For those of you who might not be familiar, Grierson was a key figure in the documentary film movement who also coined the term documentary in relation to one of these Paramount outdoor pictures, Moana, in 1926, and he very much saw these kinds of films as tools for social and democratic education. Now, I think he's particularly interesting here because having made a mark producing propaganda films for the Empire Marketing Board in the late 1920s, he would go on to found the Film Centre in London in the late 1930s with the aim of connecting filmmakers with corporate sponsors, and their first and biggest client for this would be Shell. And so, under the influence of these core members of the documentary film movement, this influence would have a major, very direct impact on the kinds of films that were produced for oil companies in the decades to come, such as the one we started with, which looked to sell these companies less necessarily as businesses and more as authorities, helping drive modern science, culture, and progress. But to stick with the 20s for now, what exactly did Paramount's world-acquainting outdoor pictures look like? Few were seen to be more successful on this front than Grass, this film following the mass seasonal migration of the Baba Madi branch of the Bakhtiari people of Iran in search of grass, pasture for their livestock. And for this, Schoedsack and Cooper's first collaboration, they were joined by the reporter and spy Margaret Harrison. We have the three of them on screen here. And it opens with this idea that the trio are setting out in pursuit of what the expository titles tell us are the secrets of our own past, those of a forgotten people untouched by modernization. Where such forgotten people were to be found, though, was not initially clear. As the film shows us, neither Turkey nor Syria nor Iraq furnished them with what they're looking for, aside from maybe some interesting footage. Before, off the screen, advice from Arnold Wilson, the chairman of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, leads them towards the Baba Madi, whose migration from their hot, dry winter home near the Persian Gulf to cooler, greener summer climes near Isfahan followed not the gravel roads used by most, but a picturesque, even photogenic mountain route. Moreover, as the territory falling within the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's drilling concession, Wilson, as chairman of that company, was able to use his influence to get the filmmakers the permits they needed to make a film like this. So it might not be visible, but the order of this world on screen is certainly one that we can say is backed or bedded in oil. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that Schoedsack, Cooper, and Harrison didn't stumble upon their subjects. Now, the first third or so of this film comprises somewhat disparate footage from the search from Turkey, going back into the centuries, as the intertitles tell us. And eventually, the very beginning, we're told, is located. From this point, where the forgotten people are found, this promised epic migration can commence. And it's to these ends that what follows repeatedly and quite tellingly invites comparison with another migration epic, namely the wagon train narrative familiar from American Western films, of pioneers, settlers, forging a way across the country to build a nation. So I want to set this up briefly as well. As I said, among critics of the day, Grass inspired regular comparison with just such a film, specifically Paramount's celebrated hit of 2 years previously, The Covered Wagon, which had been acclaimed as an exemplar for cinema made with an inspiring, unifying social purpose in mind, a milestone in the progress of the movie upward towards its highest plane of endeavour, as this book that I've quoted on screen puts it, a book the introduction for which was written by William H. Hayes, the movie czar himself. So the Western that so captured minds in 1923 was thus anything but the kind of action-heavy cowboy thriller that so many people expected from the genre at this point, a genre that was often itself criticised for the impact that it had on the minds of its often young audiences. Things like tricks, stunts, and dramatic action were far less central in a film like this than in many other Westerns around this time. Instead, it's an epic of a national community in the making. It tries to tell a story that's central to the American self-image at this point, seeing a wagon train setting out from what is now Kansas City along the Oregon Trail in 1848, overcoming the diverse waiting obstacles of the land, Indian attacks to repel, prairie fires to survive, rivers to ford. All of this seemed to provide a lesson in what it meant to be American. And in fact, major figures of the day, like Vaquel Lindsay, the poet and author of the first American book of film theory, claimed that this kind of history seemed to have a natural affinity with the motion picture. Put simply, the dominant way of understanding the nation's development to this point was that this frontier experience, this experience of going west in the name of manifest destiny and so on, had made Americans at the same time as it had built their nation. And the covered wagon seemed to have somehow translated this ideology, long a subject for other arts, into moving images for mass audiences, most notably through that spectacle of this massive wagon train itself, its real star, as the director, James Cruise, put it. Much more recently, in her 2024 chapter on this film, Jennifer Lynn Peterson has highlighted this spectacle of the wagon train in a slightly different way, arguing that the cinematic trope of the covered wagon represents a, quote, fairy tale prefiguring automobile usage. The progress of the American nation was seen to result from this movement of people as a unit, and to link it back to this idea here from Peterson, we can say that what we can say is that this would very much be recognizable to viewers as a necessary prelude to the kind of petro-capitalist modernity that they were living through. These sweeping images of pioneers advancing over and claiming the West provided, in other words, through this primary motif, an archetypal portrayal of colonialism, moving from the east of the past in the old world and battling over the continent to the supposedly untapped, unexploited promise of the West and the new. So what did it mean for Grass to link itself to this? To somehow try to link the Baba Ahmadi's trek for pasture, a recurring seasonal migration rather than sort of a colonial one, to the ideologies of the Western and the frontier process? The first thing that I would say is that it very openly invited such a comparison. Arguably, it even makes itself legible to its primary audience, English speakers in the West, by conforming this potentially alien story to one of cinema's most recognizable forms. The Persian covered wagon, as it was sometimes called, posits a kind of common human impetus behind the treks of Persian and pioneer. Staged upon the varied climes of this grand eastern landscape are episodes of a mythic narrative of migration very familiar from the epic Western. Spectacles of mass movement, moments of new life and death, hunts, camping, dancing, and of course the negotiation of natural obstacles, such as in the famous en masse crossing of the Karen River, half a mile wide, and without a bridge over its icy rapids. It's a sequence that didn't just inspire regular comparison with the covered wagon, a film also famous for a spectacular river crossing, but as we see in the intertitles here, seemed to actively insist upon it. So much like the threatening Western landscape that's ostensibly tamed by America's national heroes in a film like The Covered Wagon or a wagon train Western, nature serves as a kind of foe in this nation's battle for life, one that must be overcome to renew the community and ensure its survival. And of all the obstacles to be overcome, the snowy mountain Zard-Kuh becomes the most dreaded enemy of all, in this attempt to master the landscape, perhaps by the Bab al-Mahdi, but also by their Western interlopers and their camera. Kevin Brownlow, I think, talks about this as one of the most remarkable sequences in all of cinema. And it too is conquered in this famous vista of a people in motion, after which the party can descend into the promised land, the land of milk and honey, the land of grass, where actually nothing happens because they run out of film. Okay, so I realize it's been a while since I mentioned what I was maybe talking about at the start, but what I'm trying to show here is that in the name of making this sort of Persian story a vehicle for some kind of understanding between nations, legible to audiences elsewhere, Grass transforms this seasonal migration into a frontier narrative reminiscent of, or maybe even in, the covered wagon mode. In other words, a story on the edge of colonial expansion, one undertaken not just by the Bab al-Mahdi, but also by Cooper, Schoedsack, Harrison, and above all their motion picture camera, in their bid to reach new territories presented as untouched by modernity. And what is a frontier at the end of the day? We know from Western films that it's a territory or wilderness on the edge of expansion, on the cusp of colonial annexation, transformation, and environmental exploitation. So the frontier of Grass is one of oil, filmed using an Anglo-Persian oil company drilling concession with their assistance. While this environment is already changing under the company's influence, this is here kept pointedly out of view because, well, for one big reason for this is that because to show oil infrastructure would be to break an illusion that's key to this film's narrative and also is key to the kind of justification for colonialism it puts forward. And that's this idea that's really drilled into us through the intertitles, that the world we see and the native people therein belong to the past, that they are, quote, forgotten people who can only be found by travelling, as the intertitles tell us, back through the centuries. Thus, as we can hopefully see in the text on screen, when Grass positions its trek within a frontier discourse via a narrative structured along the lines of a wagon train Western, it does something that was firmly in vogue at the time, and that was also at the heart of this whole idea of trying to make people recognise their common humanity through cinematic education. It transforms Western and Eastern migrations alike into episodes in a consolidated human story told as one in which the Bakhtiari are, like the 1840s pioneers, part of the past in a global westward march of human progress over time. These so-called forgotten people are not presented as a present-day culture, but as a precursor to modernity, and perhaps to the fossil capitalism that was already outside of the camera's view, reshaping lives in this country. As I mentioned earlier, this way of making sense of human relations in history would see both Grass and its major influence, The Covered Wagon, become not only staples of pro-cinema writing during this period, but major influences on the development of documentary film among British-based figures like John Grierson, who I mentioned earlier, often called the father of documentary film. And we can use this connection to trace the role of oil in a couple of ways. One, as I mentioned earlier, the petroleum involved in literally making the apparatus and equipment and travelling to shoot films. Without it, you just don't have this new, strikingly modern way of seeing the world. But the second one is one that's more specific to the films discussed today. As Dan Luge tells us here, having enjoyed success making government propaganda films at the Empire Marketing Board, the likes of Grierson would turn in the 1930s towards producing industrially sponsored documentaries, with oil companies being major clients. The one I started with today, The Dawn of Iran, is an example of this, made by Arthur Elton, a kind of core member of this documentary film movement. And as we saw at the outset, it was again a film presented as educational, yet influencing audiences by making favourable images of the oil industry's contributions to modernisation available on this kind of mass scale that cinema was so suited to doing. I think then through this lineage, we can see how perhaps a representational mode that's rooted in the Western and developed in a Persian context through Iran feeds quite directly into both the documentary film genre and the larger visual culture of the oil industry that it contributed to, that helped to hide and rationalize its environmental and human costs. In the same year as Grass, we would see the release of what I have on the screen here, the Persian oil industry, again a product of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and a film seen by millions in the 20s, which I'll let play out as I sort of move towards wrapping up here. Beginning with some familiar-looking scenes, it goes on to show us, quote, the changes wrought in the land of Cyrus the Great by the most modern of the world's industries. And in it, we again see cinema putting forward an apparently educational portrayal of Persia for audiences elsewhere, one aligned with an industry determined to exploit this nation's geography and its communities. The imagery and knowledge these films produces actively supports these ambitions, and through a kind of frontier-wrought discourse of modernization, somehow justifies them. In both this and Grass, both films that were in the mid-1920s sold as vehicles for education and understanding between nations, we see films about this region being used to kind of reconcile the world's histories and cultures through an allegedly universal alternative, but one that, of course, in fact, pushes conformity to hegemonic Western colonial perspectives, ones that for decades to come would aid and abet oil companies in their efforts to reshape and ultimately exploit Iranian geography and the communities living within it. Thanks so much.